Ladies and gentlemen, heckling seats. Ladies and gentlemen, to those of you brave enough to come out tonight, welcome, and thank you for joining us in tonight's topic night, looking at our ongoing thrust, I guess, at Fremantle Sailing Club, dealing with marine environment and marine debris. I'm our Vice Commodore and also Chair of our Marine Environment Committee. Special welcome as well to Bill Henson, our Rear Commodore of Sail. It's all right, Bill, you can hide but you can't run. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, and that is Dan Burns, Dr. Dan Burns from Tangaroa Blue. Now, you guys will have heard of Tangaroa Blue before, because for the last few years we've done our big beach clean-up with the assistance of Tangaroa Blue. They are an Australia-wide non-for-profit organisation that are dedicated to the removal and prevention of marine debris, which is emerging as one of the major environmental issues worldwide. The Tangaroa Blue have created the Australian Marine Debris Initiative, so acronym, first acronym for the night, AMDI, which is an on-ground network of volunteers, communities and organisations that contribute data to the database of Australian marine debris. And Tangaroa Blue also support communities and organisations like Fremantle Sailing Club to do their bit and collaborate with industry and government as well to create change. To date, Tangaroa Blue has an army of 146,242 volunteers, including FSC members who have participated in our beach cleanups, supported a total of 16,502 cleanups in 3,252 sites, and I'm guessing that by the time people go to look these up tomorrow, the numbers will have changed. And in total, they've seen 1,185 tonnes of debris being removed, and that debris then gets catalogued and begins to give the data that Dan's going to talk about tonight. For us, after the clean-up, it's a sausage sizzle. For Dan and his team, there's a whole heap of new data to go through. Dan's a marine scientist who's worked for over 20 years with environmental consulting companies, universities and NGOs. He completed his PhD studying humpback migration off the east coast. We tried to tempt him over here in Exmouth, but you know, he's still working on that. And he didn't actually come to the west till 2009. After working for an environmental consulting company for the last 9 years, he began volunteering for Tangaroa Blue about 18 months ago, after he realised the scale of the marine debris problem, and he started noting firsthand the impacts of wildlife and the environment. So he now balances his consultancy work, which is in part running dolphin surveys, as well as developing environmental training courses, together with undertaking projects for Tangaroa Blue. And if you please join me in welcoming Dan Burns, and I'll hand over to him.
Thanks very much, Anita, and to Fremantle Sailing Club. Appreciate the kind words and the opportunity to come and speak tonight. You know, I've actually never been in here before, and I must say it's a very beautiful venue. And enjoyed the food as well. So yeah, thanks for looking after me. I hope I do that justice in the talk. I will start with talking a little bit about, I guess, Tangaroa Blue. Well, I was going to start with talking about Tangaroa Blue, but Anita's already sort of grabbed the sound bite on that part, and it sounds like you're already pretty familiar with as well. Tangaroa Blue, Australian-wide, and really that focus on trying to remove and prevent marine debris, and of course we're going to be going into quite a bit of detail on that. Let's make sure this one works before we go. All good, okay. So what I'm actually going to be speaking about tonight, I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of the marine debris problem. The more I started to learn about it, the more I realised that this is something that's not going away anytime soon. It's a growing problem, and one that we need to try to nip it in the bud as best we can, I think. I'll talk a bit more in a bit more detail about Tangaroa Blue Foundation, and I promise there's actually not too many acronyms in there. The Australian Marine Debris Initiative, or AMDI, You may hear me call it at some point, but there's not too many of them. I'll try not to. And then also, why do we do all of this? What can we actually do with the data that we collect, and how can we actually start to make a difference on the ground in that sort of tangible level? So first and foremost, I guess, or not foremost, but the basics of it, what is marine debris? You know, we don't need to go into sort of dictionary definitions, but the whole idea, the United Nations effectively classes any human-made product, whether it's, you know, manufactured, processed, or what have you, solid material, no matter how big it is, so even down to the smaller sizes of, say, microplastics, that's been discarded or disposed of in the environment. Now, that can result from activities not just at sea, but certainly also on land. As a matter of fact, it's about 75 to 80% of the debris that goes into the ocean is coming from land-based sources. And I'll talk more about that as we go. But so when we talk about this sort of broad idea of marine debris, I'll certainly be focusing a lot on plastic because it is probably the major issue. But it's not just about plastic. There's all of these other materials, of course, whether that's, you know, metals and wood and rubber and textiles, ropes. Probably a big focus being something like fishing gear. So, you know, discarded nets, fishing line, etc., that kind of thing. Now, we tend to focus with Tangaroa Blue on not just the marine side of it. So you'll hear me talking about doing cleanups and what have you. That's not just about doing them, you know, along the coastlines, along beaches. We also do them in things like river foreshores, you know, parks that are next to the river, that kind of thing. Anywhere where you could be having debris that could then, you know, wash into the river and then therefore out to sea. So I think this one, in a lot of ways, I sort of put this graph together from some of the, like a couple of the more recent, you know, best scientific publications about this kind of thing. But it's really, this graph is kind of what got me, like, we need to do something about this. This is a really big issue. So that's why I sort of don't think it's too much hyperbole to say that marine debris has become one of the major marine environmental issues, certainly worldwide, and it's increasing. It is global in scale, it's intergenerationally in impact. And the reason being this, the amount of plastic that we produce and are using, and then therefore which is being discarded. So if you look in 1950, there was about 2 million tonnes per annum of plastic was being produced. That now, if you take plastic from all sources, so it's not just primary plastics, it also includes things like plastics that are in textiles, clothing, things like that. But if you look at plastic from all sources, we're now up to about just under 400 million tonnes a year. So to put that in perspective, there's now been more plastic produced in the last 15 years, for example, than there was ever to that point in time. It's going up and up and up. You might notice this little dip here. That we can thank the GFC. Other than that, you can see that it just keeps going up and up and up. So this is a thing that I think really started to grab me about it. Now, of course, the thing about plastics is that they have very diverse uses. They're easy to produce. They're relatively low cost. They're very durable. They tend to last a long time. So nowadays, the best estimates now suggest that we're up to about 15.5 million tonnes of plastic entering the ocean per annum. Now, 15.5 million tonnes, to me that's, okay, it's a big number, but it doesn't quite mean as much. So I try to sort of break that down. I've tried to break that down a little bit. That means it's the equivalent of about 40,000 tonnes of plastic per day is entering the ocean around the world. That's nearly 1,800 tonnes per hour. It's about 30 tonnes per minute. So what, how long have we been speaking for, you know, 10 minutes? Something like that, 300 tonnes. It's just gone into the ocean in that time alone. So again, it really starts to give the perspective on it. So we might ask, well, all right, well, how much is already out there? The estimates these days suggest a minimum of 5.25 trillion tonnes tons, I shouldn't say tons, 5.25 trillion pieces, which is the equivalent of about just under 270,000 tonnes that's now in the ocean. And it's starting to be, it's been found, I guess the more we look, the more we find it. So we're not just talking about plastic being at the sea surface. There's now actually been plastic bags that have been found at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean. 10,898 metres, there have been records of plastic bags at that depth. If you're not sure, Mariana Trench in the sort of western North Pacific. Now, one of the problems with plastic, of course, in terms of the environmental impact, is that it is durable. It doesn't break down so easily compared to some of the other things that we talk about, you know, maybe wood or something like some of those more organic type substances. So plastic, there's different kinds of plastic. Some plastic breaks down faster than others. But one of the problems when it gets to the ocean is that the major way that plastic is broken down, or I shouldn't say broken down, we don't use the term broken down when we can help it. Really, the reality is that plastic doesn't break down, it breaks up. It breaks up into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. Now, there are some types that will, you know, over time will go, like, disintegrate completely. But there's also some that probably will never break down unless they are physically broken down. Now, as I say, one of the problems with that is that in the ocean, the main way that plastic is broken up is through light. It's through the light process. So you can get it through other mechanisms, but it's mostly light that does a lot of the breaking up of the plastic. Now, of course, as soon as you start getting down to any sort of depths, you don't have any light penetrating, and so it takes a very, very long time for that plastic to break up. So really what you're talking about is plastics that are at the surface and on beaches and that kind of thing is where you are getting it breaking up, and once you get down to those depths, it's not so much. Now, I'm sure everybody's familiar with, you know, some of these, you know, the more, I guess, obvious type impacts, wildlife being one of the major ones. You know, most people that love to get out on the ocean love to see the marine life. We're now finding, basically the more we look, the more we find species being impacted by this, some more than others, of course. We're finding that the numbers of species that have been recorded as being impacted by marine debris is increasing consistently. There are now all species of marine turtles have had records of, you know, major impacts from marine debris. About 2/3 of all marine mammals, about half of all seabird species. Now, to give you some examples of that, the seabirds, there's a study that was done at Lord Howe Island, where they found that more than 90% of the shearwater chicks that they examined in one study had plastic in the stomach. Now, of course, that's not going to be doing any good. This is a little bit where I sort of got the first experience of it firsthand was back when I was doing my PhD field work on humpback whales off the sort of Byron Bay area over Eastern. Was, you know, out doing a normal day's research. We go out and we find some whales and, you know, we take photos and record the data and what have you, all of the information about the sighting. We saw this whale coming up the coast towards us. And I noticed that there was behind it, there was a buoy, a float behind it about 100 metres that seemed to be travelling with this whale. What on earth is going on here? Until, of course, you know, it didn't take too long to work out, okay, it's obviously dragging it. And so we ended up going over and, you know, getting a good look sort of thing and realising that this whale was actually dragging a long line. And it was quite a long you know, distance of long line. Long story short, we called in marine parks who came out and we basically followed the whale until they could get there with all of their equipment and make sure, don't you do anything about it, you need to wait for us to do it type stuff. So they came out and they managed to disentangle the whale. But what that meant was we could then start to identify, okay, well, where'd this long line come from? And of course it had the buoy, the float. So we were actually able to determine that that was from a Taiwanese longliner, and whether it had been discarded or what, but whatever the case, that was sort of my first main experience of it. I know also, like, used to get a lot of the turtle floaters. If you're not familiar with that term, it's not a dead turtle, it's a live turtle that they're at the sea surface, they try to dive, and every time they try to dive, they just float straight back to the surface. Now, if we found floaters, we would take them to Australian Seabird Rescue and, you know, hopefully be able to rehabilitate them. Now, a lot of those turtles ended up having plastic in the stomach, things like swallowing a plastic bag. Of course, not all species of turtle, but a lot of the marine turtle species like to eat jellyfish. Plastic bag maybe looking a lot like a jellyfish. There have been studies, there were studies done in Queensland a few years ago where they found that more than a third of the turtles that they did necropsies on after they died had plastic in the stomach. And then you can see some of the other things, you know, some of this stuff I think is fairly obvious: deformity and loss of limbs, blockages, certainly death, starvation, suffocation, strangulation, those kinds of things. It's obviously not particularly pleasant. But it's not just about the wildlife. There's now increasing research, increasing evidence that there are potentially human health and safety impacts from marine debris. Findings of things like plastic debris inside fish that are, you know, fish that like edible fish that are commercially taken. They're also finding that a lot of the marine debris can have, basically attracts bacteria, and so then you get that sort of side of it as well, even if it's just a piece of debris that's been, say, out in the ocean, attract a lot of that, and then is even washed up on a beach, for example. In recent times, there's a study that just came out this year from America where they estimated that the average American now ingests or inhales about 100,000 pieces of plastic particles every year. They're finding microplastics floating through the air to places like which mountain range was it now? I think it was the Andes. I should remember that, shouldn't I? Before I go saying statistics like that. But yeah, so they are now finding evidence of this more and more. Obviously things like habitat damage, you can certainly see that from some of the pictures throughout all of this. Ingestion of microplastics by corals, things like the Great Barrier Reef. There actually have been studies that have looked at the likelihood of coral disease. Corals, it increased 20-fold. So corals that had no contact with plastic had about a 4% chance of disease or record of disease, evidence of disease. Those that were in contact with plastic had 89%. So it really starts to give some perspective on that. And then the other one being economic loss, and this is one that I think is, you know, perhaps overlooked by most of what you hear about marine debris. So when we talk about economic loss, you know, you can, as an example, see, you know, who wants to go on holidays to Bali when you sit on the beach with the 4,000 pieces of plastic? You know, that has had a real tangible effect, and it will, and has and will do in a lot of other places. In terms of some of the studies on this, there was a study that came out this year that tried to take a real holistic approach and brought in all of the different economic value, I guess you could put it. And what they estimated was that as a minimum, that each tonne of plastic in the ocean reduced what they called marine natural capital. Basically, it had a cost of somewhere between $3,000 and $30,000 per tonne that goes into the ocean. Okay, here's one that the sailing club might take know of, and I'm sure you've all had some experience of. Vessel and navigation hazards. There's around about 3,500 shipping containers are lost at sea each year. Things like fishing gear. From one study, there was the South Korean Navy looked at a 5-year period from 2010 to 2015. They have about 170 ships, or at least did during that period. I don't know if they still do. During that time, they recorded an average of 400 cases of propeller entanglement each year. So that's an average of about 2.3 per ship for every one of those 170. Now, I guess I'm throwing lots of numbers at you, but I'm a scientist. I'm always going to do that, I guess. I apologise if that's not, you know, I know not everybody likes to hear all of that. But I think it's the reason why I kind of bring all of this stuff up is because it's what really got me realising the extent of the problem. And then, of course, this is not just about, you know, damage and what have you, the actual sort of safety aspect, I guess, of the hazard. There's also the cost of repairs. The cost of cleanups in itself is huge, whether that be something like a marina or harbours or on the much broader scale. So, what to do about it? Well, Tangaroa Blue Foundation was started in 2004. It was actually here in WA, down sort of Dunsborough, Margaret River way. Sometimes people ask about what the name, you know, what's the name Tangaroa Blue mean? It was named after the Maori, or Polynesian god of the sea, Tangaroa, who made laws to protect the sea. And one of the things, you know, said was, well, if you look after me, I'll look after you. So I guess that's sort of the beginnings of it. It's now grown to be Australian-wide. I think the real thing about Tangaroa Blue was this idea that, and I hope I'm not going to result myself on the next slide, is that the idea being, okay, we can go out there and we can do all of these cleanups. That's great. We've removed that piece of rubbish off the beach. But we've seen the scale of this and the amount that it's increasing, the amount that's going out. So Hayley Taylor was one of the co-founders. She's the managing director of Tangaroa Blue. She said, well, you know, if all we do is clean up, that's all we're ever going to do. We need to take it that next step. So how can we do that? It's by starting to record the information about what kinds of rubbish is being found where and what we can then do about stopping that. So Tangaroa Blue Foundation then started the Australian Marine Debris Initiative. So the idea being that, the objectives of the initiative, now I should start by saying the AMDI, the Australian Marine Debris Initiative, is really a network of people, of which Tangaroa Blue is one organisation. So it's volunteers, it's community groups, it's schools, it's government organisations, it's boating organisations, it's, you know, all across the broad spectrum of people getting involved in trying to remove marine debris from coastlines and waterways, to collect scientific and consistent data on the types and amounts of marine debris being found, to track that to the source wherever possible, and then to work with all stakeholders to try to find solutions to stop the debris from getting there in the first place. And of course, a part of all of that is also education and awareness. So basically, it's a way that everyone can get involved to remove and try to find solutions to this debris problem. Now, Tangaroa Blue does that by providing support to members of the AMDI network. So that's things like training, clean-up materials and logistical support, educational resources. The Tangaroa Blue website's got an education kit that's in line with the Australian curriculum and tailored to the different age groups for the different parts and what have you. So how do we do that? Well, this is really just showing the process. We go, we do a clean-up, We sort out all of the debris, usually put out a big tarp, sort it all out, collect the data, I'll talk more about that in a second, and put it into this AMD database. We use the information that goes into that to try to then track that debris to the source, and then get stakeholders together to try to develop source reduction plans to try to prevent that in the first place. And of course that all then feeds back in. We want to then do more cleanups to see whether the source reduction plan worked or not, measure it over time, those kinds of things. The old version, we still have the hard copy data sheet. Some people would prefer to use that. Sometimes it's easier to use that. Then they move to these cyber trackers. Now there is an app, both for Android and iPhone, or an iPad and what have you. So you can then enter the data using the app. It can be a little bit clunky, but it's really good in that if you've got some debris that you're trying to work out what category it goes into, for example, you start typing that name in, and it just brings up all of the categories that can be, and it sort of saves you a bit of time on that. So that app is really good, and it starts to really make it easy to, you can be putting data in, you know, doing a cleanup on the beach and have the data already done really quickly. You mentioned at the beginning there, Anita, 3,252. You must have checked sometime earlier because I checked this afternoon, and it's now up to 3,254 locations where there have been cleanups done around Australia, and that information's then been entered into the database. So this is the total since the beginning of, like, the total amount in the AMD database. There's now been more than 14 million pieces of debris that have been removed from beaches and waterways and what have you. 374,000 volunteer hours at those 3,000 sites, and as you mentioned, 16,500 cleanups. And Tangaroa Blue now has more than 1,100 partner organisations around Australia. The idea being that Tangaroa Blue doesn't need to actually be running all of these cleanups, and obviously it's not possible to do that. The idea is that Tangaroa Blue is really trying to facilitate the cleanups and trying to be the hub to be able to then record the information and then facilitate how that can be used to stop the debris at the source. So this is, again, from what I downloaded today. This is actually just from the last 2 years. So the top 10 items that have been found on Australian beaches in the last 2 years. The number one, plastic fragments. Bigger pieces of plastic that have broken up into smaller pieces of plastic. And that's going to go on and on and on, as we say. Cigarette butts being one of the ones that very much, you know, local litter. Foam insulation and packaging, number 3, and then remnants of plastic bags. I guess it'll be interesting to see over time how much that changes now that we've got things like plastic bag bans in, or at least the, you know, the thinner plastic bags and what have you. Lids and tops, food packaging, things like food wrappers and what have you, broken glass and ceramics, plastic drink bottles, again, an interesting thing to measure when you've got things like container deposit schemes about to come in. Will there be changes that we find in the amount of those being found on beaches and the like? Straws, lollipop sticks, cutlery, and fishing line being rounding out the top 10. Just in the last 2 years, there's been more than 100 kilometres of fishing lines being collected and removed. So what do we then do with all of this? Well, the whole idea is that we're trying to find out where that litter came from. So, from the land, you throw, you know, somebody drops a wrapper or something, it goes down the drain, eventually that ends up in the ocean. The sewage system, sorry, those points. The wind blowing, you know, just from the park or what have you into the ocean. Certainly beach visitors being a big one, runoff from factories and dumping. And then we've got the obvious ones from the sea, you know, things being thrown overboard and what have you. in terms of, I guess one thing that's important to think about is just, depending on where you are, you get different types of rubbish coming in. Now, the rubbish that you get here, for example, on a beach in Perth is going to be very different to what you tend to get, especially around, places around the top end tend to get a lot of rubbish coming in on the currents, washing in from places like Indonesia particularly. Now, one of the issues that this raises is that it depends on the type of rubbish and what you're trying to target as to what scale you need to try to target that at and what jurisdiction you're working in. If we're talking about a bunch of cigarette butts down on Bathers Beach, you're going to have a pretty local scale to work with. But if you're talking about trying to solve those problems like, like ghost nets, fishing gear, up around the top end, you're starting to talk international, and it's a lot harder to deal with than it is your local cigarette butts or straws or whatever it kind of is. And so the whole idea of this, what do we need to do to stop this, stop the release of this, whatever the item we're targeting is, the source reduction plan. So basically, what's the change that needs to happen to solve that? That could be a change in design. I'll talk about that a little bit later with the weather balloons. It could be a change in practices, in education programs and awareness. It could be needing new policies, needing more compliance and enforcement. We really need to target all of that at the different scales. As an example, there's about 140 categories in the AMDI database. Now, some of those, again, are going to be very much locally focused, like cigarette butts. Others are going to be, on a more broader scale. But even within that, you might have things like plastic bottles. Now, if you've got, say, you've done a clean-up and you've found a bunch of plastic bottles, actually taking photographs of the label on the bottle and putting that in, it makes a difference. You find then that, particularly, say, some of the beaches down south of here, where you can get a lot of the currents washing in debris from cargo ships and things like that, oftentimes you'll be able to actually identify, well, look, that's clearly a bottle that's come from, a particular country or that kind of thing. And again, I've got a slide later that goes into that a bit more specifically. And then we've got that regional difference that I talked about. So let's say we're talking on a local level. We might want to target something on a local level, and okay, so then we're going to bring together stakeholders who might be able to help us with this. So that could be local councils, certainly almost always going to be involved, government agencies and maybe nearby businesses. If there's a cafe right there and you're finding a lot of straws, that would be obviously a pretty good way to be able to go and try to target that pretty quickly. Might be the fishing community, it might be boating, community groups, NGOs, schools, Indigenous representatives. A lot of the ranger groups are doing a lot of this now, and then just anybody else that's interested and keen to help. So that's on the local level. If we look at more of the broader level, the international level, Tangaroa Blue has actually been providing data analysis to the federal government to contribute to Australia's obligations to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So last year they produced their Sustainable Development Goals voluntary national review on what they've contributed, and Tangaroa Blue and the AMDI was actually listed as a case study, contributed to two different number 154 and number 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Sorry for the tongue-tied. So that's like life below water, which has a specific marine debris target, and also about partnership goals. So I guess I'm just trying to sort of point out how this is actually being sort of accepted and used at the government level and those sort of broader initiatives. Also been working with the, or I should say has an MOU in place with the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, AMSA, sorry to acronym at you, for almost a decade now. And so that allows us to report any ship-sourced debris through direct channels to AMSA, and they can then help with compliance responses to MARPOL legislation. So MARPOL legislation obviously regulates what can be thrown overboard. That changed in 2013. So, whereas you could throw things like cardboard and metal and glass and things like that, depending on where you were, into the sea, as of 2013, you can't. You can't throw anything. Now, one of the things about that is that, AMSA asked Tangaroa Blue, okay, well, what impact has this change had? The change in the MARPOL regulations or what have you, and from all of the data in the AMBI database, not a lot changed. And so that then starts to raise bigger questions about, okay, so the issues about how you're then actually going to try to tackle that. Developing marine debris action plans, if it's a regulation that you can't throw things off, then maybe you need to look at other ways about, trying to get better compliance and that kind of thing, getting better buy-in. Now, as an example, this is one that I was talking about before. This particular brand of water bottle is one that's produced by a company called Fuji Trading Singapore. It's a company that supplies ships. You can't actually buy this brand of this water in a supermarket anywhere in the world. They only supply it to ships. So obviously then a really good target to say, all right, well, we know that this is coming off, for example, cargo ships and what have you. And so then you can start to try to target that specifically. So I'm going to go through a few more examples. In 2018 in Newcastle, there were thousands of pieces of plastic started being washed up on beaches around the Hunter, around the Newcastle area, when there were more than 80 shipping containers fell off a ship off the coast of Newcastle. And so the database then tracks that occurrence over time, firstly through all of the items that are on the beach. So all of these buckets and what have you, for example, recorded, including their barcodes, so you can then specifically track it back and see how far those have then travelled abroad. And then the other one is when containers break open. And so then you can identify unusual spikes in particular items that have come out of some of those containers and what have you. And of course, that's one that is likely to be, these sorts of things are going to be found for time, for a while to come yet. In 2017-18, there was Tangaroa Blue had a big push and ran 11 source reduction plan workshops around the Port Phillip Bay area in Melbourne. So engaging local and state stakeholders and analysing that local data. It was a really big collaborative project that had a lot of partners involved, and then trying to reduce a number of these items: cigarette butts and coffee cups, single-use plastics, plastic bags, balloons, straws, and recreational fishing gear. All of this stuff is obviously, you're talking about targeting at a local level. And that's what I talk about as well, the difference, particularly something like this where you're really talking about a sort of an enclosed harbour. You're really going to be getting that local litter. You're not going to be getting too much stuff washing in from, ocean currents and whatever there. So looking at that whole catchment scale. So here's some examples from those source reduction plans that came about. So targeting straws, signage. That one I think was for, these are cigarette butt tins. So, a bunch of the different things to try to target some of the different things. You might have noticed similar things in the river and what have you, and beaches here now with things like bins to put, fishing line and what have you into. One of the programs that Tangaroa Blue's been really involved in is trying to get involved with these tracking litter to the source with nurdles. You may have heard that term if you're not familiar with it. Basically, these are plastic pellets or resin pellets that are used in the production of plastic. Now, Tangaroa Blue's put in a comprehensive report on it, basically, and recommended that the Australian plastics industry implement a program called Operation Clean Sweep, which was started in America. So from identifying plastic, on beaches, in 2007, it grew from there, tracked back to rivers, stormwater drains, industrial areas, and we're able to then show that there was leakage from some of those factories and what have you. Then worked with Keep Australia Beautiful's enforcement officers and the Department of Environment Regulation in WA to ensure that the loss of those pellets was cleaned up by the factories. There was a couple of factories in Malaga, and then learnt about this Operation Clean Sweep and tried to go down that path. The EPA in Victoria then released some guidance guidance around patched plastic resin pellets. And there was, in 2019, the Great Port Phillip Bay Nurdle Hunt. They had 8 plastic industry companies come with teams to help look for nurdles. Wasn't too hard. They collected about 1,500 in an hour. And then this is some of the companies that have all now signed up to Operation Clean Sweep. Now I think some of that is still, I guess I do, no I don't. Oops, right, try again. So this just goes for about 3 minutes.
Operation Clean Sweep is an industry program that looks at reducing the loss of plastic resin pellets through transportation and through manufacturing through the plastics industry.
We wanted to play our part in the industry in minimising the loss of plastic pellets into the environment, and by signing up to Operation Clean Sweep, that fulfilled our objective.
The loss of plastic resin pellets into the environment is of growing concern. Plastics make up over 75% of marine debris that's floating in our oceans, and this is a really easy way to prevent some of that from occurring. Coax Films was one of the first companies to sign up to Operation Clean Sweep in Australia, and they've been a great champion educating the rest of the industry as to why it's important to adopt this program and actually how easy it's been for them as well.
Once we downloaded the manual from the website, which had a comprehensive checklist of things that were done overseas, which had showed immediate results, we were able to identify those particular items and very easily put them into practice. The pallets that we were receiving and sending out on our truck were quite often heavily contaminated with beads. So the first thing that we did was we installed an additional air line with a gun, and before the pallets actually leave the plant, they're blasted with the compressed air. It takes off all of those pellets, stops them getting into the environment. We realised very early on in our audit that if we put loose pellets into our commercial bin, which is emptied by a commercial company, those pellets actually fall from the bin and into the environment. So now what we do is we actually bag all of the pellets that we sweep up within the factory, and that bag is sealed before it goes into the commercial bin. We identified the major source of contamination in our forecourt was actually pallets that were being delivered by our suppliers. The transport companies would send a flatbed truck that was virtually covered in tiny pellets, which had moved all the way from Altona across the Westgate Bridge to Braeside. So we contacted all of the transport companies and the polymer suppliers and informed them that since we were part of Operation Clean Sweep, we would no longer receive trucks that contained damaged pallets. Operation Clean Sweep was very easy to implement using the self-audit that's in the manual. It has not had any financial impact on the company in any way. We see a benefit in occupational health and safety, and we're doing our bit for the environment.
For a company to sign up to Operation Clean Sweep, they just need to head to the website and they can download a manual and a checklist. Then it's just a matter of going through and seeing if they are losing any pellets and implementing practices to stop that from occurring. They can take the pledge both at a business and an individual level, and then they're part of the program. It doesn't cost anything and it's really easy to implement.
So that was Hayley Taylor, so she's the Managing Director, and I've got to say, an absolute inspiration, amazing woman, incredibly passionate, incredibly driven, and has done awesome stuff, I think, to get Tangaroa Blue to where it is now. One other example, the We Refill program. So one of our corporate partners is We Refill. They provide water refill stations at things like festivals and events and what have you. So it uses tap water and filtering at the source. So it reduces, obviously, single-use plastic bottles, that kind of thing. It uses tap water instead of, spring water. And then, as an example, at Blues Festival in Byron Bay, they used these. They had this 5-sided water refill station that people could go and use their own, refill their own water bottles. Jack Johnson was sort of one of the ones that was helping to promote that, and he's done a lot of work with Tangaroa to help.
And is that set up available for lease or similar in terms of events?
I'm not sure about in WA. I'd need to follow that one up for you, sorry. Yeah, sure. Yep. Another example, strapping bands. I'll cut this one fairly short because I'm aware of the time. Because I've got a couple more examples too. But so strapping bands, basically from the lobster industry. We're finding a lot of these plastic strapping bands, and of course they were labelled so you could start to track them. So after this problem was identified that there are a lot of these bands being found in cleanups, Tangaroa Blue then started to work out where they were coming from for starters, and then obviously the impacts that they can have, and so then started working with the government basically. And in 2011, WA Fish Resources Management Regulations, they updated legislation that aimed to curb the use of these. And basically since that time, strapping bands need to be removed from bait boxes prior to them being loaded on board vessels, and you've seen that great drop in the number of strapping bands that are being found. So one example of how there was a change came about. Another one that I mentioned earlier was about design. Well, similarly, the Bureau of Meteorology has to release these weather balloons each day. I think off the top of my head, I think there's about 50 a day that get released. And what they were finding was that, of course, these float up into the sky, and then they end up coming back down again, and they are then being found in, floating in the ocean, being on beaches, all the rest of it. And there were a lot of the components which were plastic or polystyrene. And so what that actually led to in the end was that they ended up trying to change the components so that they changed out some of the polystyrene and plastic components for things like cardboard instead, where they could, so that, materials that will actually break down over time. I don't think that's gone right through for all of the balloons that they release, but it's certainly been, they've sort of started to shift it across. Balloon releases is another one. This balloon release action guide is one way of sort of getting onto that. So basically, helium balloons going up into the air, of course, both the rubber and the strings, if they're tied to, can have big impacts. Able to identify sources, of course, if, you know, sometimes they had, you know, business logos and etc. on them, so then it gives you a good opportunity to target it at the source, and that's what this part of it's about. And on a more local scale, in February 2016, Tangaroa Blue facilitated a source reduction plan workshop in Cottesloe. One of the items identified was balloons. One of the councillors, Sandra Balto, then started working with council, and the result was that they voted unanimously to ban balloons. So again, just giving some of these examples. Another one, this wash against waste. So a source reduction plan workshop in Margaret River. That's where this project was born. Basically got a grant from the Cape to Cape Plastic Free Group to buy and fit out this wash trailer that provides reusable plates, cups and cutlery, and then a washing station at the Margaret River Farmers Market. So I guess all of this is talking about, you know, okay, we're talking about anything from local level source reduction plans through to trying to affect things on a broader scale on regional, state, national, international levels. If I take it back to probably the sorts of things that you will have heard a million times, it's all for a reason, but what can you actually do on a daily basis on a personal level? Is refusing unnecessary items. You don't need that necessarily, that plastic bag, that straw, that plastic cutlery, that tiny little pieces of plastic that the big supermarkets like to hand out, that kind of stuff. You have got power as a consumer, and the more people actually make those decisions to refuse those things, ask for better alternatives. I don't want to buy that plastic, I want to buy something that's you know, degradable or what have you, biodegradable. That actually does have an effect over time. So that's a really powerful, in some ways maybe the most powerful thing that you can do. Reducing your use of plastics as best you can, trying not to buy, you know, instead of putting your fruit and vegetables in a plastic bag or something like that, you know, using other containers, just put them straight in the trolley, what have you, that kind of thing, or trying to come up with alternatives. You know, you can, I've noticed in the supermarkets now you can buy things like bamboo toothbrushes or ones that are made out of recycled plastic, things like beeswax wraps, or I sometimes use shower caps instead of using cling wrap. Just get a shower cap, use that to cover something and put it in the fridge, that kind of thing. Stainless steel water bottles instead of using plastic ones. Reusing or repurposing anything you can effectively. Giving something another life, even down to things like a takeaway container, an old bread bag. They can all be used to replace things that, you know, I think I certainly was guilty of it. You know, previously you go and buy some bags to put, I don't know, like sandwich bags or something like that. Well, an old bread bag or something like that it's still using, maybe it's better to buy the bread without a plastic bag on it altogether. But all of these things just get you thinking about ways you can reuse or reduce. And then the last one, of course, being recycle. That's not just about making sure that you put your plastic bottles and your cans out in the bin that the council comes and gets. It's about trying to do that on a broader level too. To give a couple of easy examples that a lot of people I think are still not you know, really onto or don't make the effort to, things like scrunchable plastics. Any plastic that's scrunchable, you go and you have a look outside any of those, like especially the bigger supermarkets, Coles and Woolies and IGA and all that sort of stuff, they've all got, most of them anyway, a lot now, have got the bin that you can put scrunchable plastics in that then gets actually recycled in some form. One thing that I think I forgot to mention earlier was just about the amount of plastic. So when I talked about how much is out there, of all of the plastic ever made, they estimate that about 30% of it is still in use. That's both primary plastic and recycled plastic. There's about 60% of it is either in the natural environment or in landfill, and there's about 9% was incinerated. So you think about that, there's about 60%, well, plus incinerated, that's a whole nother issue which is not good. So there's about 60% that's just gone straight into landfill or the environment. So every little piece that you recycle is meaning one more piece that's not ending up out there. And that's not going to solve the problem on the greatest scale, but it all contributes. In terms of getting involved, please get involved with Tangaroa Blue, with the Australian Marine Debris Initiative. Volunteer to clean up, collect data at a local coastal site, submit it to the database on paper, online, on the website or via the app. One thing that I'd stress on that is that going out and doing a one-off clean-up is great, but where we really start to get much more power in being able to use that data is by doing multiple clean-ups. What I try to encourage is, it might only be choose a beach, do a clean-up 4 times a year. That gives enough that you can start to get a bit of measurement over time. You can start to see you've got information to be able to feed into source reduction plans. You've got information to see if things are changing, if there are actions put in place.
And the data that goes in terms of logging that against the site or a location, are you able, as an organisation, to retrieve that? So, for instance, where you guys are able to look at a measurement of change, are we able to get that back as well to look at a measurement of change for the sites that we're targeting? Yeah, so you then just, like, if you want specific targeted data, you just email to the database crew and tell them what you want, and then they'll develop, get a report for you. And so you can sort of set the terms of, we've done this clean-up here, or dates, or whatever it happens to be. There's a certain amount that you can do yourself online through the database. You sign up to use the database, and then you can get reports on, for example, by local government area or by specific location, or you can go back and have a look at what's been found at Port Beach in the last 6 years or in the last 2 weeks or that kind of thing. But yeah, if you want more tailored stuff, you can get that. One thing that I will most definitely plug is the WA Beach Cleanup. It's an annual event. This is the 15th year it will be happening. So people from all over WA going out and cleaning up their part of beach or river, what have you, any sort of waterway. It's going to be happening around that weekend of the 19th and 20th of October. Ideally on that weekend, but if you can't do that specifically, as close to that time as possible. We've now opened registration for that. So there are a bunch of ways you can get involved. Basically, we'll provide a clean-up kit and all of the information and what you need on that front. But you can either email this WA Beach Cleanup, at Tangaroa Blue. There's some little flyers up on the table up the front there. There's a sign-up sheet if you want to put your email down. But yeah, please get involved in that. I think last year we had something like more than 1,000 people anyway up and down the coast of WA that were involved. Certainly follow Tangaroa Blue on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, on the website, join the mailing list. You can make a donation at the Tangaroa website. And the other one that I was going to mention was we have also got a clean up sooner than this. There's actually one being run in conjunction with Kathmandu. I did that one last year, and it's a really good one. It's at Point Walter on the 8th of September. I think I can't remember if it's 9 or 10 a.m. that it starts. Anyway, it's all on the Tangaroa website. So, lastly, I will thank you all very much, particularly those that have already been involved with Tangaroa Blue, all of our supporters, partners, volunteers, and very much thank you all hardy souls for braving the weather and for listening to me rant on. Thanks very much. I'm happy to answer some questions.
I've just got a question, because I know that there's certain areas around here where I've done beach cleanups with a whole bunch of different organisations, some of whom are recording everything that they clean up.
Yep.
Do you know if they pull data with you or you pull data with them? Because if you know, one organisation's cleaning up every 6 months, and then Tangaroa Blue's cleaning up in the opposite 6 months.
Absolutely.
How are we pulling all that together to get the big picture?
Well, I guess that's hard for me to answer without knowing who the groups are that you're talking about. But absolutely, that's imperative. You know, to get everybody to working together.
Sea Shepherd's one of them.
Sea Shepherd puts all of their stuff into the AMD database.
Oh, brilliant.
One thing I would say about that is that, look, I think like most probably are onto it. I think Tangaroa is really grown. And as I said, there's a lot of people now putting their information in. The Australian Marine Debris Initiative is not Tangaroa Blue full stop. Tangaroa Blue is just facilitating it. And I think that you can really see the amount that it's grown and the amount of people that are starting to put in. So if you know someone that's not, please let them know, put it in, or get talking, get some communication going. That's the whole idea.
I've got friends in dive clubs and informal groups, so yeah.
Well, because the other thing about that is that's really important is that once you get everybody doing the same thing, then you're also standardising the data. You don't want groups collecting different types of information or what have you, or categorising something differently. You don't get, you lose the power of being able to use that data.
Thank you.
But yeah, it struck me, like it's only in about the last 3 years from memory that the database, so the database went from 2004 until about 2015 it might have been. It took that long to get up to 10 million pieces of debris removed, and then it went to 13 million last year, it's now to 14 million. Like this was late last year that went to, so it's really starting to increase quickly. So I think that gives a bit of a handle on that as well.
Yeah, Dan, you talked about cleaning up the beaches and collecting rubbish, plastics from the shores. There's a few groups I've heard about that have been trying to trawl out in the oceans to remove big clumps of rubbish from these Gaia things that are swirling around. Just wondering if you know how successful, how they've gone with that. Pretty ambitious sort of plan there.
Yeah, that's right. And I think at the moment the big ocean cleanup, they're just now at the point of going and trialling the next lot. So they've tried before, but they had some issues with. I mean, it's not just a simple go out with a big net and scoop it all up. As I say, it's that whole plastic soup thing of you're not just talking about the surface, you're talking about underneath. You're trying to make sure that you don't have wildlife getting entangled. You've got all sorts of engineering issues that are way more technical than I can start to try to explain. So yeah, I think there's been promise, but not success. I think some of the other things that are happening, folks like you may be aware of the Tangaroa Foundation. So here in Perth, trying to really work on a global level to do things like target some of that plastic in. There's a fairly small number when you look on a global level. Particularly a lot of the Southeast Asian rivers where you're getting a huge amounts of plastic coming. So trying to target it on those sorts of levels at rivers, I mean, that to me is one of the areas where you talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, for example. That plastic's already out there. We need to try to work out ways of cleaning that up, but when we know that there's 75% of stuff coming from land and a lot of that's going through rivers, if you can try to stop it there from getting out, that seems like a pretty good way to get ahead a little bit.
Yeah, I guess Dan, on sort of a related question. I understand Indonesia's number 4 in the world in terms of the amount of plastic. Are you involved in any programs up there in terms of trying to stop the amount of plastic getting into the ocean to start with?
The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is I don't know the details of it. I've only really been on with Tangaroa Blue for a few months of getting my teeth solidly into it, and Heidi would be able to answer that question for as long as you were prepared to answer, I'm sure, prepared to listen, I'm sure, and I'm very happy to follow up on that. But yeah, I don't know the details. I know certainly we've been doing work with Indonesia, yeah.
I don't understand that years ago when my kids were younger, and I'm a old tart, we used to have the old, brown paper bag, which were heavy duty and did the job. Why can't we bring them back? Or are they also the problem?
Well, I think that's, that raises that sort of interesting point of, like, for starters, yeah, I think they are coming back to some degree. That's an alternative. I think plastic bags is a really good example because I think there's a lot of the community now is pretty onto bringing their bags to, the grocery shop and that kind of thing. But there's different kinds of bags are better than others, and what are like as an example, you take a canvas bag, well, yeah, that's much better than plastic on one level, but it's used a heck of a lot more water to be able to produce that. So there's the different products you're using have each got their own impact.
Yeah. The thing is, I don't see any shops there putting out an ordinary paper bag. So why isn't it getting pushed for everybody? Because that was something that we could go and burn it, get rid of it, put out the smoke, didn't cause a problem. You don't seem to have that area that we're pushing.
There have been, like now, there's been a bunch of studies done looking at, okay, well, what's the best option? And depending on what you want to focus on, even things like actually bags that are made out of recycled plastic are a pretty good option from a general environmental point of view. That's something like that, if it was used enough, it all comes down to how many times the things are used. So if you use a paper bag and it's only used once and then it gets burnt, perhaps that's not the best environmental option. Whereas if you've got, even if it was recycled plastic and it's used 400 times, you're probably getting ahead. So, yeah.
Actually, it's used more than that because basically the bag was used for then rubbish or something else. Because we didn't have this sort of situation, we only had that to use, so it was used quite a bit. But I'm taking note of what you're saying for sure.
I think it really is moving that way too, though. Yep.
I was just curious about Tandy's effect on large commercial industries, because I understand, so you obviously influence the government to initiate new laws or protocols against plastic and all these small businesses, but larger commercial industries, for example, Coke as an example, have you guys had any effect on them? Mentos wrappers, we keep finding absolutely nuts, so we thought you guys have any influence on them yet?
Again, I think that's probably a hard question for me to be able to answer because I'm not as familiar with what has happened, to date. And I'm sure, folks like Haiti could give you a much better answer than I can. Having said that, I think this becomes, it becomes a point where you need to be, working out what's the best way of actually getting a result. And so that's generally going to need a whole bunch of different people working together to try to get the result. Now, when you start talking about, trying to make major impacts on Coca-Cola, you're talking massive and need massive, momentum, for want of a better word, to be able to get that sort of level of impact. As I say, I don't know specifically on those ones, but again, I can only say I can, find out more for you. Please, maybe send me an email and then I can get back. Any more? No? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Folks, just before you slide out of here tonight, or I don't know, I guess dissolve out of here tonight in the rain. As I said, very, very appreciative of Dan and Tangaroa Blue coming along tonight to share the information with us. Apart from the WA Beach Cleanup, Fremantle Sailing Club is also organising a beach cleanup on the 17th of April next year. Yep, we do plan ahead. But we've actually picked that up for a Friday because it will be during school holidays, so we're hoping that we can have lots of juniors, people bringing their children or grandchildren along to help out with that.
Which beach do you think?
We normally go down to Woodman Point, and so what we have is that we have a lot of people on the beach, but we've also got our divers in the water under the jetty, and we found some really interesting things there. For those of you who would like to make a donation, Tangaroa Blue, you can either do that online or alternatively there's a collection tin here as well this evening. Marine Environment Committee, who's hosted this evening, one of our initiatives is that we do have the Fremantle Sailing Club Key Cups here because we're sick of picking up the plastic lids from takeaway coffee cups in the harbour. So if you're after one of those, there's a few available up there. Marine Environment Committee also through Annie, Steve, Dean hiding in the back there. Look, we are a committee that's been recently set up here at the Sailing Club, and even though, you know, those of us on the committee have some pretty strong ideas about what we'd like to be doing, as a committee we serve the club, so there is a survey available. You'll have received either the link online or there are paper copies here. We'd love to get your feedback on what you see as the priorities from marine environment for the club. And very finally, those who are members at Fremantle Sailing Club and who have a pen or pen lease or a hardstand lease, just a reminder that tonight is possibly your last opportunity to enrol to vote in our local Fremantle elections. Kay's here and has the forms if you haven't already enrolled to vote. You know, we work with Fremantle City Council. We're looking forward to working much more with Fremantle City Council in terms of sustainable initiatives and having our members let the council know that that's important to us is a priority if we can get it. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Please have a good evening, and I believe the bar is open.
I don't know. I bought him cruising section, I bought him dinner.